Meine Damen und Herren, ganz herzlich willkommen hier bei uns im Körber-Forum. Schön, dass Sie an so einem regnerischen Maiabend hier zu uns gekommen sind. Wer von Ihnen hat den Film Ziemlich, beste, Freunde gesehen? Oh ja, das ist eine Menge. Das ist eine Menge. Bei dem Film geht es um zwei Männer, die sich trotz ganz unterschiedlicher Hintergründe und ganz unterschiedlicher Ausgangsvoraussetzungen am Ende angefreundet haben und zu einem richtig tollen Team geworden sind. Auch bei Israel und Iran gibt es sehr unterschiedliche Hintergründe, sehr unterschiedliche Ausgangsvoraussetzungen. Dass diese beiden Länder aber irgendwann mal zu einem tollen Team werden oder im diplomatischen Jargon würde man wahrscheinlich sagen, eine nachhaltige Verbesserung ihrer Beziehungen eintritt, das ist im Moment zumindest eher unwahrscheinlich. Israel und Iran sind seit 1979, seit der Islamischen Revolution, in herzlicher Feindschaft verbunden. Israel fühlt sich bedroht von der anti-iranischen Rhetorik, die man immer wieder aus der iranischen Führung hört, von der anti-israelischen Rhetorik, die man immer wieder aus der iranischen Führung hört. Israel fühlt sich bedroht von Terrororganisationen, die von iranischer Seite unterstützt werden und man beäugt das iranische Atomprogramm aus Jerusalemer Sicht mit sehr großer Skepsis. Man ist der Meinung, dieses Atomprogramm dient nicht nur friedlichen Zwecken. Auf der anderen Seite, auf iranischer Seite, gibt es auch jede Menge Vorbehalte. Iran sieht sich zum Beispiel von israelischen Sabotageakten gegen Atomwissenschaftler bedroht. Es gab Cyberattacken gegen das iranische Atomprogramm, die auf Israel zurückgeführt werden konnten. Stuxnet ist hier ein Schlagwort. Und aus Teheraner Sicht findet man auch völlig unakzeptabel, dass Israel Iran das Recht auf Urananreicherung abspricht und dass Israel letztlich einen Regime-Change in Iran fordert. Die Beziehung, sie war nicht immer schlecht. Vor 1979 gab es eine intensive Kooperation zwischen Israel und Iran. Und, das wissen viele nicht, auch noch nach 1979, nach der Islamischen Revolution, gab es Zusammenarbeit, zwar limitiert, aber in bestimmten Bereichen, zum Beispiel während des Krieges zwischen Iran und Irak in den 80er Jahren. Da hat Israel nämlich Waffen an den Iran geliefert, und zwar, weil man damals der Auffassung war, dass der Irak die größere Bedrohung für Israels nationale Sicherheit ist als Iran. Ziemlich beste Feinde, Israel und Iran in der Konfliktregion Nahost. Darüber wollen wir heute sprechen. Ich glaube, dieses Thema ist so aktuell wie wenig andere Themen. Sie wissen alle, dass am 30. Juni die Frist abläuft für die Verhandlungen zwischen den sogenannten E3+3-Staaten und Iran. Da geht es um sozusagen um die abschließende Lösung des Atomkonflikts. Und vieles spricht dafür, dass es gelingen wird, dieses Abkommen zu erreichen. Eines kann man heute schon sagen, sollte dieses Abkommen tatsächlich in die Tat umgesetzt werden, dann wird das den Nahen und Mittleren Osten auf lange Sicht verändern. Wir wollen heute fragen, welche Rolle wird denn dieses Abkommen auch im Verhältnis zwischen Israel und Iran spielen? Wie sehen sich diese beiden Länder eigentlich? Was sind gegenseitige Wahrnehmungen? Und ist sowas wie eine Annäherung überhaupt denkbar? Und wenn ja, was sind die Voraussetzungen und Bedingungen dafür? Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir zu diesem Thema heute zwei ganz hervorragende Diskutantinnen in Hamburg haben. Ich weiß nicht, ob die beiden ziemlich beste Freundinnen sind, aber mein Eindruck ist, dass sie sich auf jeden Fall gut verstehen. Und ich glaube, das, was wir heute Abend hier auf diesem Panel präsentieren werden, ist in zweifacher Hinsicht ziemlich einzigartig. Zum einen, weil es ein All-Female-Panel sozusagen ist und zum anderen, weil wir eine israelische und eine iranische Diskutantin hier bei uns haben. Begrüßen Sie mit mir ganz herzlich Ori Rabinowitz und Ariane Tabatabai. Ori Rabinowitz ist Politikwissenschaftlerin, Autorin, Journalistin. Sie beschäftigt sich vor allem in ihrer Forschungsarbeit mit dem Thema nukleare Nichtverbreitung. Sie lebt und arbeitet in Tel Aviv und in London. Und Ori, wir freuen uns, dass Sie heute bei uns sind. Ariane Tabatabai. Auf sie trifft, glaube ich, die gleiche Job Description zu, wenn man das so sagen kann. Auch sie ist Politikwissenschaftlerin, Autorin und Journalistin. Sie forscht und lehrt an verschiedenen renommierten Unis in den USA. Auch sie beschäftigt sich mit dem Thema nukleare Nichtverbreitung. Sie hat Wurzeln im Iran und ist immer wieder auch in Teheran, nicht nur im Rahmen ihrer Forschungsarbeit, sondern auch um Familie und Freunde dort zu besuchen. Herzlich willkommen, Ariane. Ja, meine Damen und Herren, jetzt bleibt mir nur noch Ihnen und uns allen einen spannenden Abend zu wünschen. Wir werden hier auf dem Panel auf Englisch weitermachen. Wenn Sie lieber auf Deutsch zuhören möchten, dann setzen Sie sich einfach den Knopf ins Ohr. Und in diesem Sinne fangen wir jetzt hier an auf der Bühne. Let me start before we go into this whole issue of the nuclear talks and what's going to come out of it. Let me do a bit of Derrida here in the sense of doing a bit of deconstruction. We all know that the relationship between Iran and Israel is very fraught. There are so many misconceptions and so many misunderstandings. And what I wanted to ask both of you is to tell us, what is the greatest myth in Iran and in Israel about the other country, and how would you deconstruct this myth? Maybe, Ori, you want to give it a try.
Just off the top of my head, if I had to pull something out of a hat, I would say that maybe the greatest myth would be that the Iranian people are intrinsically hostile to Israelis and Jews. I think that if anyone in Israel actually thinks that, I think they're wrong. And even if we go back and really if we just very, very briefly touch on ancient history, actually the Persian culture has a great impact on Jewish culture. It goes back to Jewish communities living under the Zoroastrian majority in ancient times and picking up on many of the, I know it's very ancient, Zoroastrian traditions of purity versus impurity, and these are very, very, very deeply entrenched concept in Judaism, just to start with. But even if you follow up on that, the Emperor Cyrus the Great, and this is 500 years before Christ, he basically was the first true global, let's say, Zionist leader, because he gave a very famous declaration called the Cyrus Declaration, basically telling the Jews that they can go back home to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem. And that statement plays a very significant role in Jewish history and in Israeli ethos. So even if you just touch on that so very briefly, you immediately get a sense of how deep this relationship is and how many overcurrents you have running there.
So this is one myth from Israel. What's the one myth from Iran, Ariane?
Well, let's start with Cyrus the Zionist. I think that'll be an excellent book title, so maybe that should be our next one. I think the issue is that since the 1979 revolution in Iran, and you did a really good job of essentially summarizing very complicated, very complex relations, there has been so little connection between Iranians and Israelis that a lot of people in Iran in the post-revolution generation have never really met an Israeli. So they're not really sure what an Israeli looks like, actually. Not that different from them, obviously, but they just have no idea. So I'm not sure that there is a single myth about Israelis, though I would say that the predominant thing is obviously that I guess Israelis want to attack Iran. It's very much security focused. It's very much focused on the nuclear issue, and it's very much politicized.
If I may add,
sure.
Just again, and if we're just throwing stuff from the top of our heads, I think that a large myth that could be debunked possibly by both sides is the fact that the other side is monolithic. Right? We can't say the other side is monolithic.
Oh, okay.
Is there an Iran that wants a single thing? Is there an Israeli body that wants a single thing? These societies are so not homogeneous, so heterogeneous, and so not monolithic that I can't think of a single thing that I can say that would apply to the entire group of, even if we just reduce it to Israeli Jewish citizens, of a single thing they think about Iran, and I'm pretty sure that maybe vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a very interesting point that leads me directly to my next question. I was in Isfahan last year, and we went to the Friday Mosque in Isfahan, and there is this one part of the mosque where you have this Star of David, which faces the gate that used to lead to the Jewish quarter adjacent to the mosque. And that shows how deeply intertwined the Persian, Iranian culture and Jewish culture are to some extent. So, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, there are about 9,000 Jews or so still living in Iran. And I wonder, Ariane, this Jewish community in Iran, what role does it play? I mean, it's very small. Does it play a role at all? And if so, does it also play a role in the way Iranians perceive Israel?
Well, so these are very complicated issues. I think one of the biggest questions that I have to answer very often, and people are often surprised to find out that, as you said, there's still a lot of Iranian Jews who live in Iran. And actually, they live perfectly normal lives for the most part. My neighbor growing up was Jewish, a Jewish family, 3 sons and a husband and wife who were architects, who actually built our house and a lot of houses in the neighborhood. And then my parents moved years later, and my mom bought another apartment in a different neighborhood, and her neighbor happened to be Jewish again. So I don't know what my mom is doing, but she's following the Tehran Jewish community around, apparently. But it's, you know, they're very much integrated into society for the most part. You don't really know who is Jewish, who is not, if you're interacting with them very simply. That said, the level to which they're integrated into the political system is not great. Of course, you know, it's a very small community. They have the representative in the Majlis, however, in the Iranian parliament. And there have been people who have held positions of power, but I would say that that's somewhere where Iran has not been doing a very good job, essentially. Now, do they influence non-Jewish Iranians' perceptions of Israel? I'm not sure. I don't think so, I would say. I think that Iranians at this point have been living, well, actually, let me rephrase. Iranian Jews have been living in Iran for such a long time that they are completely different, seen completely different from Israel by regular Iranians, even though I'm sure that there's some, you know, criticism inside Iran by various people when Israel does certain, you know, undertakes certain policies. I'm sure that there are push and pulls with regular Iranian Jews as well. But for the most part, I think most Iranians know that they can't sort of intertwine Israeli policies and the Iranian Jewish community.
Right. So it's 9,000 Persian Jews in Iran, and it's 200 to 250,000 Israelis with Persian roots in Israel, and there are some very famous figures among them, such as the famous pop singer Rita. She has a Persian background. So do you think, Ori, that these people can function as bridge builders, or is it quite the opposite? Do they tend to be even tougher on Iran?
It's an excellent question. I will disappoint you by saying I don't have a definite answer to that. Just off the top of my head, again, sorry, last week I was chatting with an Iranian Israeli that came to Israel from Iran when she was 14. She's in her mid-30s. Our kids go to nursery together. And when we mentioned the subject, she bristled because the reason her family left, and there's a reason why she's in Israel, was because they had negative interactions at the time, 20 years ago. And they experienced some anti-Semitism, and that's why they left. So if you build on someone with that kind of background, I don't think bridge building would be their cup of tea, and there was a lot of baggage. I think, on the other hand, if you look at other people from the Israeli Persian community that have maybe less of a baggage and they didn't live under such circumstances, they can absolutely play a bigger role. And especially if you look at singers and culture leaders, culture figures, they have a very significant role to play. I'm going to be a bit pessimistic here in saying that the role is limited, unfortunately.
So it's all about politics in the end.
Most of it.
Right.
Rita, the singer, will not bring peace between Israel and Iran.
Although she has a lot of very nice songs about peace.
And she comes from the same place in Israel I come from.
Okay.
So.
Can I add my
Sure.
2 cents on this too? So to my knowledge, I echo what Ori was saying. You know, it seems like a lot of Iranian Israelis are, in fact, more conservative than, I would say, certainly the rest of the Iranian diaspora in other countries. And I think a lot of it has to do, going back to what you were saying, with when they left Iran, which is, for the most part, right after the revolution and during the 80s. And that was a very tough time. You know, obviously the war was happening. It was right after the, the revolution. It was at a time where Iran was still struggling to find its new identity, political identity under the Islamic Republic. And of course, one of the main things that happened during the revolution was the criticism of how much influence Iranian Jews had received, perceived influence that they had received under the Shah. So for all these reasons, I think that they do certainly come in with a baggage that is different from folks who've, perhaps left in the 90s or in the 2000s, because they had seen Iran evolve and the revolution evolve to some extent.
So what I see and hear from you is that, yes, there are cultural ties between the two countries, but in the end, it all boils down to the political relations. And here I want to come to the one issue that you're both experts in, and that of course is the nuclear negotiations and the talks that are going on at the moment, and possibly the deal that will come out of it. Now, the deadline is looming large. As we said, it's on June 30. And I think if there is one thing that is sure, it is that it will be some sort of game changer for the region. Now, I'd be interested, again, a question to both of you. What are your greatest hopes, but also your greatest fears about this deal? And Ori, maybe you want to start.
Excitement.
You're already
being very excited. Greatest hopes. So I differ in my personal opinions from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu has largely expressed great fears of the coming deal, and he went to great lengths to try and thwart it. Most of you probably have heard of his visit in March to Washington, and it was received, and I've been to Washington in March. I actually happened to bump into Ariane there, and it was received with quite a great deal of shock by friends of Israel on Capitol Hill, because it's not often that an Israeli leader declares war on Jewish Democratic senators. Not your first target if you're an Israeli leader, by any means. So I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's objection to the deal stems from several reasons, which personally I happen to disagree with some of them. I think that he's a Puritan in terms of what kind of deal he believes that could have been reached with Iran or should have been reached with Iran. And he was very adamant that Iran should have zero enrichment capabilities, and it's a no-starter. And Ariane, I'm sure, can maybe elaborate on that, but it's not something you can negotiate with. If the other side tells you that it's just not negotiable, you can maybe try to reach it if you really want to in other means, but not in diplomatic means if the other side tells you that it's just not negotiable. I think that from the little that we do know about the coming parameters, it looks like a deal that has the potential to ensure that Iran will not be able to produce nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. And there's a time limit on that, but I think it's moving us ahead. I don't think it's moving us back. I think the fears are legitimate, but I think a good way of dealing with these fears is moving ahead with such a deal, not in any parameter possible, but I think that the parameters that have been floated around are good parameters. I think that to a great degree, the Netanyahu now and the leadership are coming to terms, or starting to come to terms with the realization that this deal is going to pass. And if you've been following the news, then you know that there are ongoing negotiations about a very, very big compensation package between Israel and Washington, similar to a compensation package that's being negotiated with the Arab states in the Gulf, where Washington is basically trying to offset some of the fears and convert them into military aid, etc. And we're talking about a deal that would increase aid from by a ballpark estimation of around $900 million a year, so a huge increase. So it does seem like the Israeli willingness to start talking about compensation means that they're coming to terms with it. So I hope I answered the question. I think that the parameters of the deal that we know, they outline a good deal. The greatest fear would be, of course, that it would turn out to be, in hindsight, a bad deal, and that in a short time span Israel would be faced with a nuclear-armed Iran. I don't think this is what will happen. So just to frame it, this is the fear, and it's very reasonable to address it, but I actually think that the deal we're seeing will probably address it.
I want to come back to the issue of what could alleviate Israel's fear. But before that, Ariane, what from a Tehran point of view, what are the greatest hopes and the greatest fears regarding the deal?
Well, I wasn't going to address Tehran's perspective, but I was going to give my own, and then I can maybe throw in some things from Tehran's perspective. But I would say that there are two levels. One is a technical level and very much closely related to the nuclear issue, and the second level is a political level. So on the nuclear front, this deal does three things, which to my mind are a great thing for the region, for the international community more generally. The first one is that it limits Iran's sensitive activities to the extent possible. And Ori mentioned this fantasy that you can ask Iran to give up its enrichment program altogether after having invested so much in it is just that, a fantasy. The second thing is it provides more transparency and therefore more guarantee to the international community that what Iran is doing is going to remain peaceful. And then the third thing is monitoring, enhanced monitoring of Iran's facilities, of Iran's activities, which again should provide more guarantees to the international community that what Iran is doing is going to remain peaceful for nuclear power and energy purposes, no weapons activities. Now, on a political level, the good thing about a prospective deal is that it will empower the team that is currently in place in the foreign ministry, led by Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. That is very much a team that is seeking engagement, including with folks in the region, including with folks who have been going out of their way to try to derail the process. I'm hinting here at Saudi Arabia, for instance. And this team has proven to not only be willing to spend its political capital on this, but also to pay the cost at home. A lot of Zarif's extending his hand to the Saudis has actually come at a great cost for him domestically. But he's been willing to, he's had the vision, he has this, well, I don't know if you can call it a vision, but he has this goal, he has this policy that he perceives being a useful one in the current situation that is going on in the region, and he's willing to pay the price for it. So if there is a deal by June 30th, or a few days after that, as we seem to hear rumors about.
Middle Eastern time.
Middle Eastern time, exactly. There will be, this team will be empowered, will have more political capital to spend on engaging the region and engaging with the West. If there is no deal, however, and this goes to my biggest fears, well, this group will really lose a lot of its political capital. Not only these guys, not only Zarif and his team, but reformists and moderates more generally who have been thrown their entire sort of support behind this group. And after that, there is not going to be a similar process for a very long time. because at this point, so many people, so many groups, from the Supreme Leader to the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, to regular people, have put their support behind this process. And if there is no tangible outcome, then there's not going to be a similar process. There's not possibly going to be a negotiated solution over Iran's nuclear program. And that means, for, I guess, Israeli purposes, it means unlimited activities on Iran's front, on Iran's side. It means less transparency. It means sort of going back to the status quo ante, meaning before the interim deal of 2013. So from my perspective, that's not good for anyone. It's not good for Iran. It's not good for Israel. It's not good for the region. And it's not good for the West.
Mm. You opened up, or you touched upon a number of very important issues, from the domestic implications in Iran that the deal is going to have through to the regional repercussions, and we'll touch upon those. But I wanted to come back for a second to the issue of Israel's fears and how to address them. You mentioned the GCC countries that got together in Camp David on the invitation of Barack Obama, and they got this package of reassurance measures. So you mentioned that something is being negotiated also with Israel. So what are concrete measures that could alleviate Israel's fears? I mean, as I understand it, one of the big fears is that this inspection regime that the international community agreed upon under the Lausanne Framework Agreement, that this is practically impossible, that this is not going to work. So, I mean, what could overcome or help Israel overcome these fears?
So, first of all, I agree with you as regards to the analysis of what the great fear is. Of course, on the Israeli side, the fear is how can we be sure that this agreement will actually promise us that Iran won't develop nuclear weapons without us knowing it. So, to put it very simply. So I agree with this analysis. Unfortunately, there isn't any magic solution to it. We don't live in a world where there's a specific technological solution that can ensure a country that it won't get hit by nuclear missiles. That's the problem with, the general problem with nuclear weapons, nuclear warfare, nuclear missiles. They'll hit you. So it's not as if you can insulate yourself completely, and that's why nuclear warfare is so intimidating, and that's why it basically deserves a category of its own. It stands to reason that any kind of strategic tightening of their relations with America and buying, and by the way, the shopping list is huge and is massive, and it looks like the Gulf states and Israel are really, going to town and buying everything and anything that they can from America, but it doesn't mean that that will guarantee, even psychologically speaking, an Israel or ally or alleviate an Israeli fear of being attacked by an Iranian bomb. That's why nuclear weapons are so dangerous. You're not going to be able to alleviate this fear. So I'm afraid I didn't rain on. I hope I didn't rain on your parade in that sense, because there isn't a thing you can do. I think that as long as the monitoring regime that's being set up by the agreement, the better it is, the less fears Israelis will have. But it looks like it's a fait accompli. It's almost a fait accompli. I don't want to just declare that a deal was reached. Obviously, the deal we'll only know in early July whether it was reached or not. It looks like it's almost for certain will be reached, I think. That's my analysis. I don't think that the Obama administration will leave any stone unturned after they've invested so much in trying to reach a deal. I don't think they'll just back off it. But unfortunately, there isn't a magic pill that you can give the Israeli leadership just to alleviate these fears.
So Ori mentioned the military dimension of Iranian nuclear activities, and that is still an issue that is being disputed and which is still under question until the deadline expires end of June. So how do you think, how important is this issue, Ariane, and how likely is it that the E3+3 and Iran will reach an agreement on that one as part of the final package?
Well, it seems like a number of creative solutions are being proposed. It seems like there are some ideas that are essentially going to be sticking. And one of the big questions right now in trying to address that issue actually is for Iran to provide access to its military sites, not nuclear facilities, but military sites, which is something that it doesn't have to do under its obligations, but that the international community, well, the P5+1 wants Iran to do in order to sort of provide more transparency, to address the questions that have been sort of troubling the international community so that they can sort of start with a clean slate. I think it is quite likely that some level of agreement will be reached. A lot of the work will, however, have to be done between the International Atomic Energy Agency and Iran afterwards. It wouldn't necessarily be in the context of the negotiations themselves.
Mm. I want to come back for a moment to the issue of the domestic repercussions of the deal in Iran. You said that if and when there is a deal, it will certainly strengthen the hand of the pragmatist camp around President Rouhani and his foreign minister Zarif, who's also the lead negotiator on the talks. So do you think that, or what is the likelihood that there is a different scenario? Would it be imaginable that also other groups within Iran could benefit from the deal in the final analysis?
Certainly, I mean, everything is possible. One thing that is interesting and that we've seen so far is that there is essentially a quasi-national consensus around the negotiations and around supporting the team. There has been, and you've probably all heard about it, there's been a number of, there's been a lot of criticism, vocal criticism of the negotiations. There are folks who think that the negotiating team has been given up too much, has been making too many concessions. The Iranian parliament has tried to pass bills saying, here's a list of red lines that you should not cross, including don't limit the enrichment program for more than 5 years, for instance. At this point, to give you an idea, we're looking at between 10 to 15 years, more like toward the 10 years for the enrichment program per se. But so there has been a lot of push and pull, but the major authorities in the country, the biggest, the loudest voices essentially have been supporting the negotiations. This includes the supreme leader, who is the highest political power in the country, who essentially has a veto power over all matters, foreign and domestic. It includes the very powerful paramilitary forces, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that I just mentioned earlier, and you may have heard about them in the context of regional issues with Soleimani and the Quds Force being involved in Iraq, the selfies in Iraq and Syria, but mainly in Iraq. So I mean, all these groups have been supporting the negotiations. Of course, when the Lausanne Agreement was announced, there was this outburst of popular support and joy in the streets of Tehran and other big cities, which looked essentially like Iran had won the World Cup. It did not look like a political, a nuclear deal of all things had been reached. This is not normally arms control. Deals are not something most people are even aware of, let alone follow so closely. I mean, everybody was basically sitting in front of their TV, watching what was happening, and BBC Persian and domestic channels were all, covering this whole thing 24/7. To the point that there was nothing to say actually at some point. So it's something that most Iranians want solved because. And it's not because people care about the nuclear issue per se, it's because it's interfering with their daily lives. Sanctions are interfering with people's normal lives. If you've gone to Iran, for those of you who've been to Iran in the past sort of 10 years, you've seen the impact of sanctions on average people. And also because a lot of things have been put on hold to deal with the nuclear negotiations. So a number of domestic issues that are very important to people can't be dealt with unless this big issue can be solved and moved to the side. But so to come back to your question, gave you a very sort of a long way around this. I think that everything is possible. I think the most likely scenario is that immediately after a deal, the hardline camp will be doing a lot of push and pull, trying to put more pressure on the government, but that after a while, the moderates and the reformists, well, the moderates, sorry, not the reformists, will gain more political capital to deal with other things.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the people celebrating out in the streets and dancing after the result of the Lausanne talks was announced. Now, I think that people are also see in this deal much more than as you said, a nuclear proliferation agreement, but rather the end, or the possible end of Iran's isolation as an international actor, and also to some extent as a regional actor. Now, Ori, from an Israeli point of view, an Iran which is maybe strengthened, which has sort of gone out of its pariah status internationally and also regionally, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
The Israeli leadership, and Netanyahu almost said so verbatim, sees this as a very, very bad outcome of a successful negotiated deal. And one of the quotes that came a few weeks ago from one of the governmental meetings that he chaired, if I remember correctly, was that his fear wasn't that Iran would be caught red-handed. His fear was that Iran would stick to the letter of the agreement, paving the way to its full reintegration. This is what I'm saying. It's not what Netanyahu said. But this would pave the way to Iran being reintegrated back into the international system and emerging as a very powerful hegemon in the region, increasing its influence over its neighbors. And we have to remember that Israel and Iran are currently engaged in an ongoing proxy war. These two countries are not just a bit hostile to each other. There is a war going on. Iran, it's a proxy war, it's a cyber war, it's a shadow war, it has many facets. Iran supports two factions that are very preoccupied with Israel, Hezbollah and Hamas. Hezbollah currently is less preoccupied with Israel because it's preoccupied with defending the Assad regime in Syria. And that's one aspect of it. Israel reportedly was, I don't have a specific knowledge about this, but newspaper reports said that it was probably behind the Stuxnet, the cyber attack against the Iranian program which you mentioned. So you had news reports about that being an Israeli-American cooperation. So these two countries are at war. So it's not an overt war, but it's a proxy war, it's a cyber war, it's a shadow war. In the Israeli perspective, seeing Iran being reintegrated into the international community is not a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Let me just sharpen this point a little bit. What the Sunni Arab states and the Gulf states in particular would say that, Iran is now practically in control of what four traditionally Sunni Arab capitals, Baghdad, Beirut, Sana'a, and Damascus. So if the sanctions will be suspended or dropped entirely, then Iran will have even more resources at its disposal to carry on with this, what they perceive as an expansionist policy in the region. So, Ariane, what's your take on that? And I mean, some comments from that have come out of Tehran recently weren't particularly helpful in alleviating those fears.
Well, you stole exactly my connection. That I think we see exactly this a similar concern from the Gulf Arabs with Israel. That they're in a way, I think that when you talk to Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, officials are likely to tell you behind closed doors that they're much more worried about an integrated, normalized Iran than they are about a nuclear Iran, actually. They would much rather have a nuclear Iran that is not powerful, that is not integrated into the international community, than have an Iran that is doing well, but that is not nuclear. So that sort of, and I think that to some extent perhaps Israel shares that view, though I'm not sure about the nuclear part, so I might be taking that a bit in the other extreme. But to go back to your question about the 4 Arab capitals that Iran supposedly has, it's just, it got to a point at some point that senators in the US were repeating this, saying it actually has 5 capitals and it includes Tehran. So, people are getting really worried about this whole thing. They're getting really worked up. But in reality, the truth is very far from that perception. First of all, the degree to which Iran controls Damascus is questionable. The degree to which Tehran controls Sana'a is not at all what has been reported. We know that Iran has had some level of involvement with the Houthis, but that's not been to the same degree as Iraq. I would say the one place where Iran has actually been really involved and it's really been, its influence has really shaped up is in Iraq. And there is a difference between Iraq and the other capitals you mentioned. The reason is that Iraq is next door to Iran. It shares a border that is very wide. And the last time Iran had a big international conflict or a big conflict with a different state that was devastating was with Iraq. That was the Iran-Iraq war, which you mentioned, where Israel and Iran essentially cooperated behind closed doors. So for Iran, seeing ISIS, the Islamic State, taking over huge chunks of territory in Iraq, seeing folks who were involved in the Ba'ath party in Iraq who attacked Iran essentially come back with different hats, or different flags in this case, it's really worrying. And again, I would say that even though there is no national consensus on Syria, on what Iran is doing in Syria, a lot of people don't think that Iran should be supporting Assad. Likewise, a lot of people don't think Iran should be supporting Hamas or Hezbollah. But I think that most people, regardless of political allegiance, you talk to in Iran, will say Iran is right in doing what it's doing in Iraq. And that's the reason why Soleimani has been running around and taking selfies, and he's been so open about, not him per se, but Tehran has been so open about what it's doing in Iraq, where it hasn't been in Syria and in Yemen, for instance, because those are not, they're not inherent threats to Iran's national security, whereas Iran and the whole situation with the Islamic State certainly is. So I would say that a lot of the whole talks about 4 capitals is just blown out of proportion, and that the reality is that really it's essentially in Iraq, and that's about it.
If I may add something, so the remark about the 4 capitals is taken from Netanyahu's speech, which is interesting and telling. I think, I'm not sure, I agree with how you portray the degree of involvement, but I think we just don't know where it will end, and that's a part of the fear. I think that if we go back to the Israeli angle here, I think there is a lot of fear in the Israeli leadership that Iran would use its influence as a coin, as a bargaining chip, and there's a fear that the Obama administration, in lieu of its failure in its Middle East policy, its highly criticized Middle East policy, would be enticed to reach some sort of a bargain with Iran, where Iran would use its regional influence to stabilize the region and to lower the flames in some points, and with the price being paid by Israeli currency, with the price somehow being reflected in terms of Israeli interests, in terms of, again, and this touches on a stronger Iran. Another fear is that this will somehow be translated into the nuclear deal, which again we have no knowledge of, but it's a fear. Will it play a part in the nuclear deal? Will it be translated into a greater willingness by the Obama administration to make accommodations on the deal? So there is that angle, there is that fear.
It's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to add 2 more thoughts to this. And let me premise by saying that I disagree with the majority of the Iranian government's policies in the region. But 2 things. One is that while the GCC has been complaining a lot about Iran's position, where is the GCC? In Iraq. The Islamic State is not just a threat to Iran, it's also a threat to the entire region. And yet, they've been very reluctant to do anything.
Well, some of them are part of the coalition.
They're part of the coalition, but who else besides Iran has been willing to put as much resources and troops and boots on the ground and so on as Iran has been? So Iran has been willing to take the lead on this, again, because it sees Iraq as a viable threat to its national security. But essentially that the rest of the region could be more active in containing some of these issues. AQAP, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, is doing pretty well right now with everything that is going on in Yemen. And they're not just a threat to Iran, they're a threat to the entire region. And yet we're seeing a lot of reluctance by a lot of regional parties to intervene on this. So, of course, Iran is taking the lead on some of these things, and it gets criticized for what it's doing. And again, I don't necessarily agree with a lot of what its policies are. The second thing is that Iran has also been, and this is to the credit of Zarif and his team, they have been trying to reach out to some of the folks in the GCC. Zarif, his first op-ed was in a Saudi outlet. He most recently wrote something in the New York Times, again inviting the Saudis to engage with Iran, because there's a realization in this current team that unless Iran and Saudis manage to sit down and have a conversation, regional issues are not going to go away. But none of these have been, the Saudis haven't really taken the opportunity to return this. And a lot of it goes back to their own threat perception and so on, which we can get into. But essentially, the issue is that Iran has been taking steps for once toward some of the regional parties, but they haven't been reciprocated.
I agree. I mean, you mentioned Zarif's charm offensive vis-a-vis the Gulf states, but
again from Netanyahu's speech. So,
so it's interesting who's quoting whom here. So, but what I hear from a lot of people from the Gulf, they say, okay, Iran should not only talk the talk but also walk the walk, and that is something I wanted to ask you, Ariane. What, in terms of very concrete confidence-building measures, could Iran offer to its regional neighbors beyond, reaching out and saying nice and beautiful things?
Well, as far as I know, Zarif went to Saudi after King Abdullah passed away, and he didn't really manage to meet with anyone. And he got into, again, going back to what I was saying before, he got into a lot of trouble for that in Iran, where people were saying, what were you doing going and talking to these people? They clearly didn't want to talk to you. So he actually spent some of his political capital, and right now he really can't be doing a lot of that because he has a nuclear issue going on. But it wasn't reciprocated by the Saudis. In terms of what Iran can do, I think that it takes two to tango, right? At this point, unless the Saudis come around and shows a sign of being willing to actually engage, I don't think Iran can do anything in the immediate future. If there is a deal, I think that there's going to be more attempts by the current team to do something. What it is going to be, I have no idea. But in the immediate future, in the next sort of 6 weeks, I don't think that he can do much.
It's interesting that both of you mentioned this one non-Middle Eastern power, which is still very powerful in the Middle East, and that, of course, is the US. And I think the US also plays a key role when it comes to relations between Iran and Israel. What we see at the moment is that the relations between Israel and the US, which, they've been very close allies forever, have been deteriorating over the past years, whereas the relations between the US and Iran, which have been enemies forever practically, have been undergoing a process of thaw or detente recently. So I wonder, Ori, from your point of view, what is the relevance of the US in all of this? And do you think it'll take a grand bargain between the US and Iran first in order to have some sort of detente also between Israel and Iran? That is at least what some people would claim.
So I think, again, it's a great question. It's so wide that it's quite a challenge to answer it in a couple of minutes. First of all, I would pick up on one of the things you said, that the Israeli-American alliance has been strong forever. It's, from a historian's point of view, I have to say that it's not 100% the accurate description, because, but it's relevant. It's at there. It definitely peaked, but it's important to realize that once upon a time Israel was a relatively very marginal Western associate in the Middle East. And if you go back to the Kennedy administration, when Israeli Prime Minister Ben Gurion went in '61 to see him, and one of the things they talked about was Israel's nuclear advances. He wasn't received in the White House because Israel wasn't an important enough actor to be received officially in the White House. So they met at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. And Ben Gurion had to really repeatedly ask the Kennedy administration for them to receive a few puny Hawk missiles. So and that relationship very, very slowly grew over time to what we see today. It wasn't always like that, and I'm saying this because it's important to understand that it shouldn't be taken for granted. It will not always be like this also. Alliances, they come together and they drift apart, and what we're seeing now is an alliance drifting apart. I think that President Obama has demonstrated a great deal of commitment to Israel's security in his willingness to boost its missile defense system. If it's Iron Dome, I don't know if everyone here in the audience knows what Iron Dome is, but it's a missile defense system. And there are other layers of this missile defense system that Washington is invested in. And you see it in the recent compensation package that's being negotiated. So the problem for Israel, at least how I see it, is that it's running in the opposite course to Iran. Its international standing is it's basically conditionally being eroded all the time, domestically, internally. Israel is not the same Israel, or at least how the world perceived Israel in terms of its domestic population. It used to be perceived as this very liberal, very secular society. Demographics have changed. It's becoming increasingly more religious, less tolerant, less liberal. So it's changing demographically. And I think its international standing is being eroded. I don't know if everyone knows this, but tomorrow FIFA is planning a vote on whether or not to expel Israel from FIFA. UEFA said that they will vote against it, but this is a very telling sign, right?
Well, FIFA has a lot of problems.
Yeah, FIFA has more problems than Israel, ISIS, and Iran together.
Israel together, yeah, exactly.
Right, combined. That being said, we see the growing. We see the BDS, the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions campaign growing. You see you see important actors going above Israel's head, and instead of talking to it, and I'm specifically referring here to a French initiative to establish a Palestinian state. The French basically said that they're not going to discuss it with Israel, they're just going to submit an initiative to the UN Security Council. So this is telling of Israel's international standing to date, and this has to be a huge red flag for the Israelis, because relations with America are of strategic importance, and in my personal opinion, the relationship with America is the single most strategic element for Israel's security. It's much more important than anything else. You lose that, you lost. You basically created a huge hole in Israel's security. So America is playing a very, very important role in Middle East politics, in nuclear politics. And my greatest fear would be for Israel to lose that strategic friendship. But I think that the process we're seeing is Israel's international standing gently being eroded, while Iran's international standing will gradually increase over time. And I'm going to even, recount myself yet another time by saying that, yes, Israel's international standing is being eroded, but the United States is not going to ditch Israel tomorrow. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen over the next presidency. A famous American academic phrased it very eloquently. He said, Israel is too big, too large to sink. The relationship is not just going to sink. It's not a ship that will sink in the water and disappear. And with all the criticism that the Obama administration has on Israel, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, even if you really disagree with Netanyahu and you're sitting in the White House, you're still going to think, there is this island of relative stability which has a certain importance.
In this triangle between Israel, Iran, and the US, there is one bone of contention, of course, which is called the question of Palestine. Now, it seems to me that rhetorically this issue is very important for the Iranian leadership. You have the annual Quds Day, which is, I think, on the last Friday in Ramadan, which is always a nice, occasion to show support to the plight of the Palestinian people and all of this. At the same time, my sense is sometimes that this is more paying lip service than anything else. Would you share this analysis, Ariane?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to actually refer to an Iranian-Israeli scholar who I think has phrased it the best way I've heard, David Menashri, who says that essentially, Iran has been pragmatic in most of its foreign policy decisions, despite its rhetoric. The one place where it hasn't necessarily been as pragmatic has been, and where ideology has often trumped other things, is Israel, the Israeli issue. That said, I do think that I agree with you. I think that it's much more in narrative than it is in actual policy for the most part. And again, going back to what we were discussing before, all Iranians might agree that Iran needs to be active in Afghanistan. It has to be active in Iraq. These are vital to its national security. Most Iranians don't necessarily care about what's going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
We talked so far about the issues that are very difficult between Israel and Iran. Now, I want to leave enough room for the look ahead. And here I'm quoting you, Ariane. You said in an article that you published not that long ago that it is high time for a paradigm shift in the relations between Israel and Iran. Now, what exactly do you mean by this, and what should this paradigm shift look like?
I should ask you. You seem to have read it more recently than I have. From my perspective, Iran and Israel have much more in common. Strategic interests. I'm not talking about cultural stuff and arts and sorry.
And Rita.
Yeah, and Rita. Yes. But they have a lot of strategic interests in common that Iran and the GCC, for instance, don't share, and Israel and some of the neighbors don't necessarily share. That said,
like what? I mean, what are those shared strategic interests?
In terms of their status in the region and their outlook on regional security, I think that if you go below, if you sort of dive deeper than the rhetoric of, the Ahmadinejad era and the Netanyahu era, the current, I guess.
Epoch.
Yes, your book. The two countries have historically shared much more, and that's why, as you were mentioning at the beginning, under the Shah, there was a cordial cooperation going on between the two countries, even though Iran never really, never recognized Israel as a state, right? Even under the Shah, because it was trying to sort of balance its strategic interests that it had in common with Israel, but also its status with Muslim states. That said, Iran and Israel are not going to start, having that paradigm shift anytime soon. So that's something that, from my wishful thinking, would be a good thing for both countries, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. That said, it's also a mistake to think that the two countries have not been engaging. And here I'm going to quote Ori's father, who was engaged in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty negotiations. And in a talk he gave when I started my PhD and Ori was finishing hers, in our school, he said that the Iranians and the Israelis were actually engaging on this topic behind closed doors during the 90s. And yet, that was the height of sort of the whole anti-Israeli rhetoric. All hope is not lost. And the two countries can and do cooperate occasionally when they have to, but they don't make it open. They don't make it widely public, essentially.
Can I add something?
Just to follow up on this, Ori, the one thing it seems to me that Israel and Iran have in common is that they're both different from the rest of the Middle East, if you will. They're both non-Arab. They're both non-Sunni countries. They're both somehow eyed suspiciously by their neighbors. So, Ori, would you say that this is enough of a commonality of interests that somehow should lead up to some sort of covert or overt cooperation?
So I agree with what you just said, and I think it's important to remember that the Jewish nation and the Persian nation are two of the most ancient civilizations in the region, maybe the world. Very, very ancient civilizations, go back thousands of years, and with intricate dynamics between them, and there's definitely a richness to the history. That being said, it's not enough. And the reason it's not enough has to do with the point you both mentioned about the vitriolic nature of the rhetoric. So the rhetoric that's been deployed by the Iranian leadership, especially in, I'd say, late 90s and early 2000s, was very vitriolic. A peculiar mixture of anti-Semitism, anti-Israeli sentiments, anti-Zionist sentiments, and I don't see a reason to reproduce it here, but it also touches on Israel's singularity, and one of the things that characterize Israeli society is its hyper-sensitivity to questions of rhetoric. So statements made by Ahmadinejad and the leadership during his time and before that, and will not be swept under the table because it touches on a specific Israeli Jewish sensitivity that's maybe peculiar to the Israeli society, maybe not, but it will pose a huge stumbling block. It will create a huge roadblock down the way. Maybe we can't see it just now, but it has the potential to evolve into even a greater problem, even when we define it as rhetoric, because of the sensitivities, because of the peculiarities of the situation. So I don't think the shared history and the fact that these two countries share these commonalities, being non-Arab, non-Sunni, I don't think it's good enough. In the 50s, in the 60s, these two countries were part of a sort of a periphery alliance. The Israeli strategy, Ben-Gurion's strategy, was to try to form an alliance of periphery. So he went to Iran, and he had some talks with the Turks, and he had and Israel offered some assistance to the Kurds, and they found other actors in the Middle Eastern neighborhood that weren't the immediate Arab neighbors that were willing to be a part of some sort of a second-tier alliance. But that card has been played to date, and I don't think it's enough to create a second card. And what you mentioned about the grand bargain, a grand bargain scenario, and when we say a grand bargain, we mean this very complicated, very big, very wide in scope peace bargain that would have an Israeli-Palestinian component, an Iranian component, American oversight. That's the grandness of the bargain. You have to have the stars aligned exactly where you want them for that to take place. And there were initiatives, and you have to have and they failed. Sorry, I should have completed my sentence. There were initiatives and they failed because when the Iranian leadership signaled that it was somewhat interested in that, you had the Bush administration in the White House, and there wasn't an interest in America to be overseers of a deal like that. And if you have a leadership like the current Israeli leadership, you won't have a partner in that side. And I can't say about the current Iranian leadership. I don't know if it's something they would be interested in or not, but the stars need to be aligned in such a particular way for something like that to happen that we can hope that it will happen, but it's not something that will happen soon.
Now, before I turn it over to our guests here, I don't want to go into astronomy and constellation of stars.
Our area of expertise, right? We can chip in on this.
So, but what I would like to ask the two of you is to sort of wrap this up is just to finish one sentence, and the sentence here is the following: to work towards detente, Israel or Iran should. And you have to do the So Ariane, what's the
No, we're academics. We can't. We cannot possibly finish a sentence. Well, I think from the I think on Iran's side, it's perhaps easier. It would be to go back to what Ori was saying, was to tone down the rhetoric, and because I'm an academic, I'm not going to finish here. I'm going to add another sentence, which I think actually the Rouhani government has been doing pretty well. In the past sort of year and a half, it's de-escalated the rhetoric that we had seen under the Ahmadinejad administration.
So for me, I would say that the answer goes through the Palestinian track, making progress on the Palestinian track, on the issues of the settlements. We can go into that later on in the Q&A. I don't want to bore the crowds, but any accommodation would have to go through the Palestinian channel. You cannot ignore that.
Well, that's a wonderful final word for this part of our conversation. Ja, meine Damen und Herren, jetzt sind Sie dran. Sie kennen das schon hier bei der Körber-Stiftung. Wir haben noch genug Zeit für Ihre Fragen und Ihre Kommentare. Ich würde Sie bitten, sich ganz kurz vorzustellen, wenn Sie Ihre Frage stellen. Bitte seien Sie so nett, fassen Sie sich kurz, damit alle drankommen, und sagen Sie vielleicht auch, an wen unserer beiden Panelistinnen sich konkret Ihre Frage richtet. Und ja, wer möchte als erstes? Der Herr da vorne in der zweiten Reihe.
Frau Rabinowitz, wir haben jetzt für eine Stunde gehört über die Gefahren der nicht existierenden iranischen Nuklearwaffen. Könnten Sie kurz berichten über das Nukleararsenal von Israel? Und was existiert?
Sure.
Und wie erklären Sie das eigentlich als besonders gute Verkäufertechnik oder als blanke Erpressung, dass Netanyahu in der Lage ist, Waffen, die in seinem eigenen Keller existieren, als furchterregend für ihn selber zu verkaufen? Denn überall, wo er hingeht, erzählt er hat Angst. Aber nur er hat die Dinge, die Angst machen.
Punkt verstanden. Ori.
Can I go?
Sure.
Sorry. So thank you for the question. So, hang on, I don't want to hear myself. It's a bit confusing. So I'm an Israeli academic, so I'm at liberty to say what I want. I don't represent the government or anything like that. I'm a researcher, I'm a historian, so I'm very happy to... Sorry. I'm very happy to answer a question. I have no problem in addressing it, and I wrote a book about it, so happy to do it. I don't have a private personal knowledge of Israel's nuclear capabilities. I researched it in my academic capacity as a historian, so it's not, I haven't run around Dimona with a camera. It's my knowledge based on the literature I read and the archives I've been to and my common sense. So your first question had to do with Israel's nuclear arsenal and what can I tell you about it. So I can tell you about it from my reading on it. Sorry? So according to the most recent reports, Israel stopped manufacturing nuclear warheads, or there is an assumption that it stopped. Naturally, no one knows for sure. These are reports that surface in the media. Yes. Yes, it absolutely means that. So according to this, so I think, if I can be allowed to, do you want to address the question? Or do you want me to address it? Okay. So according to these, according to the estimations, the arsenal's size is about 80 nuclear warheads. This is according to a publication called the Nuclear Notebook. It's published by the. I don't understand the question. 80. Yes. So this is according to a publication called the Nuclear Notebook. It's published by a journal called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. As for the ancient history of the project, it dates back before the days of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which we heard about today. Israel is not a signatory of the NPT, and it developed its capabilities before the treaty, so the treaty doesn't apply to it from a legal perspective. Iran is a signatory of the NPT, and it has certain obligations that Israel legally doesn't have, not being a member of the NPT. As for Israeli blackmail, I don't think that Israel's nuclear arsenal is the biggest problem of the Middle East. I agree with the common held assumptions that establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East would be a great idea, and a WMD, a weapons of mass destruction and free zone in the Middle East, would be a great idea. But there isn't a consensus about how we reach that point. I do think that Israel's nuclear arsenal isn't the region's biggest problem. I think that if you look at what's happening now in the Middle East and how nation states are crumbling, and if you look at the fights between the Sunnis and the Shias, I really don't think you can say that it's the fault of Israel's nuclear arsenal. So I wouldn't place it on the top of the agenda, and I don't think it's a blackmail weapon or a blackmail tool that the Israeli government deploys. My personal view is the opposite. I think that the leadership has been very responsible in terms of being a responsible nuclear actor. If you think about 1973 and the Yom Kippur War, Israel was reportedly already armed with nuclear weapons, but it never used them, never signaled them, never did anything with it. And I think it's indicative of being a responsible nuclear actor. And you have to think, Israel isn't the only nuclear actor in the world. We have several other nuclear actors, and they each, it's the only nuclear capable, it's difficult to...
Wir haben ja auch noch einen Empfang nach der offiziellen Veranstaltung sozusagen, und ich bin sicher, dass Sie da die Frage auch noch bilateral ein bisschen umfänglicher klären können. So, ich wollte noch eine Sache sagen. Wir haben ja heute eine ganze Reihe von Schülern auch unter uns. Das finde ich eine super Sache. Wenn Sie Lust haben, sich auch ins Gespräch mit einzubringen, dann haben Sie natürlich präferierten Zugang hier. Aber ich habe eine Hand hier in der Mitte gesehen. Ich glaube, die Dame da hinten mit dem roten T-Shirt war als erstes dran.
Mein Name ist Barbara Erhard-Gessenharter. Und in Anknüpfung der Frage eben würde ich gerne von Frau Tabatabai wissen, welche Ängste die israelische Nuklearausstattung für den Iran macht oder ob das gar keine Rolle spielt.
Yeah, so, I mean, you know, this is something that has been at the forefront of Iran's recent comments at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, a conference that happens every 5 years to discuss the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I would actually argue that, you know, from my perspective, that's not the biggest issue for Iran. What is much more, what's the much more vital, immediate threat to Iran right now is ISIS. It's what's going on in the region in that respect rather than Israel's nuclear arsenal.
Ich habe, genau, da hinten 2 Hände gesehen. Vielleicht erst der Herr in der zweiten Reihe.
Dankeschön. Eine Frage an Frau Tabatabai. Es wurde ja von dem Antisemitismus gesprochen. Ich meine, in Deutsch stelle ich die Frage, nicht?
Ja, wie Sie wollen.
Und wir erinnern uns alle an die Aussagen von Ahmadinejad, das wurde ja auch erwähnt. Das ist heute weniger glimpflich, aber doch hört man bei jeder Gelegenheit, ob man bei der Militärparade oder bei irgendwelchen Veranstaltungen, dass man ausruft, Tod Israel, Tod auch Amerika, oder über eine Sache verhandeln wir gar nicht, dass Israel ausgelöscht werden muss. Es passieren doch in Abständen immer wieder ganz klare Aussagen von verantwortlicher Seite. Wie würden Sie diese Aussagen beurteilen? Ist das nur äußerliches Gerede? Ich meine, wir Deutsche kennen auch solche Aussprüche. Und wir kennen auch diesen Antisemitismus hier von uns aus. Und wir haben das auch nicht ernst genommen. Ihre Beurteilung, ist das auch nur äußeres Gerede oder ist das eine tiefere Hass und Einstellung, der sich dahinter verbirgt? Dankeschön.
Ariane.
Well, that's a really tough question. I mean, obviously, I think that what Ahmadinejad has said and others have said is reprehensible. That said, does it actually involve a policy dimension? I don't think so. I think that, as we were discussing earlier, it's much more rhetoric, ideological rhetoric that is used for political purposes rather than anything else.
Ich habe gesagt, dass die jungen Gäste heute präferierten Zugang haben und das Versprechen möchte ich auch einlösen. Deswegen der Herr in der dritten Reihe.
Ich bin immer so aufgeregt, wenn ich diese Fragen stelle, deswegen weiß ich nicht, ob ich mich so gut formulieren kann. Ich wollte an Sie meine erste Aussage richten, Nora Müller. Sie haben ja gesagt, dass Amerika und Iran schon seit jeher verfeindet sind. Und das stimmt nicht ganz, soweit ich weiß, weil vor der Islamischen Republik in der Monarchie haben Reza Schah Pahlavi und Amerika kooperiert, auch mit ziemlich effektiv für die Wirtschaft, aber weniger effektiv für die iranische Bevölkerung, vor allem im Land. Darauf wollte ich halt hinweisen, dass sie nicht ewig verfeindet sind. Und ich habe eine Frage an euch alle drei, ruhig, ob das Atomprogramm von Iran immer noch ein so heikles und groß benanntes Thema wäre, auch aus amerikanischer Sicht, wenn es in Iran keine großen Ölvorkommen gäbe. Sehen Sie da oder gibt es da einen Zusammenhang?
Ja, spannende Frage. Welche Rolle spielen die Rohstoffe des Nahen Ostens für die Politik der Weltmächte gegenüber dieser Region? Ori, your take.
So, thank you for the great question. Way to go, young generation. So, of course, oil supply, energy supplies from the Middle East are of supreme geostrategic importance in almost anything that goes on in the Middle East. But we have to remember that as of today, America is moving towards being energy independent. Or maybe that was the framing of your question, but America is going to be less and less dependent on oil imports in general and from the Middle East specifically. Some people think that it would probably mean that it would have greater liberty when constructing its policies on the Middle East. Time will tell because we're not there yet. It also has to do with the technology of fracking, which you might have heard of. It has less to do with nuclear energy, but we might see a renaissance in nuclear energy. We're seeing some buds of a renaissance of nuclear energy in the Middle East. Correct me if I'm wrong, the only nuclear power plant in the region is in Iran. Interestingly enough, and I think it's an important question we can touch on, Israel is a country that until the late 90s lacked any kind of domestic form of energy, and it imported all its energy needs. Until 1979, it imported most of them from Iran, and when the revolution happened, it really had to find alternative sources of oil imports. But for several peculiar reasons, Israel does not have nuclear energy infrastructures. It doesn't produce nuclear energy per se, or nuclear energy period. And this is interesting because on the face of it, you would have said, well, the one country that is importing 100% of its energy needs and has a lot of nuclear infrastructure should have been able to develop nuclear energy, but they never developed a nuclear power plant, even though you had plans to establish such power plant going back to the early 1970s. And even during the Johnson administration, there were talks about establishing a nuclear desalination plant, so a plant that would use nuclear energy to desalinate water. But these outcomes never happened. But I think that, and maybe Ariane, I'm sure you have a lot of things you want to say in this regard. I think that the oil card was played to its fullest with events surrounding the invasion of Iraq and Saddam Hussein being toppled, and they're very relevant now also, but less so in sense of how much oil Washington needs to import.
Ariane.
Yeah, well, since we're doing a bit of history, interesting fact is also that Iran's nuclear program started as part of something that was started by the Eisenhower administration, the Atoms for Peace program, that actually ended up proliferating a lot of the nuclear technology that we see around the world today, including in Iran. So the US actually gave Iran its first reactor under the Shah. And then the nuclear program essentially stopped after the revolution for a little bit, and then it was resumed. And finally, in the 2000s, it became the big file that we all know today. So why is Iran's nuclear program such a big deal? Why does everybody care about it? Is it oil? Well, I think that there are three important issues. One is that, as Ori was mentioning, Iran is a member to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means that it has voluntarily undertaken to not get nuclear weapons. Israel, like Pakistan, like India, has not done that. So they don't have any legal obligation to not get nuclear weapons. But Iran does. And that's something it's an obligation that it didn't give up. So it could have, in 1979, when the revolution happened, Iran could have said, you know what, we're going to withdraw from this treaty now because we didn't sign it. The previous guy signed it. We don't want it anymore. But they didn't do that. And Iran continues to insist that it's doing everything in accordance with the NPT. So that's the number one reason why it's such a big deal. The second issue is the region, and more generally what Iran has been doing since 1979. I think that a better explanation might be to look at whether or not the US would have been as preoccupied by Iran's nuclear program if the Islamic Revolution didn't happen. What would the international community's response be if Iran had undertaken exactly the same things without the Islamic Republic in power and with the Shah in power? I suspect that there would be some difference, though this is all for extrapolation, right? And lastly, I think it's wrong to portray this as just something that the US is doing. Remember that the people who are negotiating with Iran right now are led by the US, but it involves Germany, it involves France, the UK, China, and Russia. And by proxy, essentially the entire Middle East, actually. So Israel is not officially at the table, but it's been very much involved in the process via the United States, and likewise with the Gulfies. So it's not a US-Iran issue, it's an international community Iran issue. Whether or not oil has to do anything with it, I don't think so, and I agree that I think that the whole card was played to this fullest extent with the Iraq War.
Vielleicht nur eine Fußnote zu dem, was Ori gesagt hat, zum Thema Energieunabhängigkeit der Amerikaner. Ich glaube, dass das richtig ist. Ich glaube aber trotzdem, dass Energie weiterhin ein wichtiges Interesse der Amerikaner in der Region sein wird. Und zwar deswegen, weil viele amerikanische Alliierte immer noch darauf angewiesen sind, Öl- und Gasexporte aus dem Nahen Osten einzuführen. Und deswegen werden die Amerikaner, glaube ich, selbst wenn sie selber energieunabhängig sind in Zukunft, immer noch ein sehr klares Auge darauf haben, dass diese Ressourcen auch weiterhin nutzbar sind für ihre Alliierten. Ich habe mir hier vorgemerkt, den Herrn mit dem roten Pullover ganz in der Mitte. Bitte sehr.
Ja, danke. Gerd Weberpals, also im Prinzip, glaube ich, finden wir das ja alle gut, dass die beiden Feinde in Anführungsstriche sich annähern durch die Gespräche und dass sich da eine Wandlung vollzieht. Das war auch hochinteressant. Sie sagten, die Lösung oder Amerika entfernt sich so langsam etwas von Israel und nähert sich etwas vorsichtig dem Iran an. Ist ja aus meiner Sicht als Laie verständlich, wenn ich sehe, wie Israel da vorgeht mit der Besiedlung und mit der Palästina-Frage, die ganz Europa ja anders sieht. Ich meine, kann nicht sein, dass man alles kaputt bombt und wir zahlen das dann wieder, wird wieder aufgebaut. Die Frage aber, das war nur eine Grundbemerkung, die Frage an Frau Tabatabai, eine ganz kurze Frage. Man stellt ja fest, dass die jetzige Regierung im Iran einen anderen Kurs verfolgt als vorher unter Ahmadinejad. Was ich gehört habe, in Anführungsstriche als Laie, kann es sein, dass letztlich der oberste Religionsführer des Iran die ganzen Gespräche abbrechen kann. Ich habe mal sowas munkeln hören. Wenn das zu weit in Annäherung geht und die Regierung zu liberal wird, sagen wir mal, dass er da sagen kann, Ende, Schluss. Ist das so?
I would say that technically, yes, that is, I guess, true. He does have the final say, again, as I mentioned, on most issues. But, he has been very supportive of the negotiations so far. And in a more recent speech, actually, he went somewhere he hadn't gone before, which was to say that this could serve, the negotiations, could serve as a test for further Iran-US cooperation if they succeeded. So he's essentially, and this is something that he, previously he had said, this is only about the nuclear talks, we're not going to do anything else, we're not going to seek any rapprochement with the US. But now he's sort of saying the opposite of that. So it's also interesting to note the passing comments that are mentioned here and there because they have a very significant impact for Iran's future policy. That said, I think that in the immediate future, and as far as the nuclear negotiations are concerned, he seems supportive. All major authorities in the country seem supportive. One of the key concerns that I hear often in the US, and I assume that it's, you share these concerns in Germany and the rest of the EU as well, is whether or not he's going to sign off to a final agreement. And my argument is that it would be a mistake to think that he has no idea what's going on in the negotiations. He has a direct channel to the negotiations. He knows what's going on. He's informed of the details. And we've seen in recent weeks as well that every time something comes up where he's not very comfortable, he comes up and makes a very public statement. He's not shy to share his thoughts and says, look, this is my red line. I don't agree with this. So I think that he has, so far we can assume that he's open to the process, that he's open to a possible deal that falls within the framework that he's sort of foreseen, the red lines that he's foreseen, which are fairly flexible, actually, and that he may or may not in the future endorse more rapprochement between Iran and the US, though that's further down the line. I don't see that happening immediately after a nuclear deal even.
Wir haben ja einen Tick später angefangen, deswegen haben wir Zeit noch für eine allerletzte Frage. Und der Herr da hinten in der letzten Reihe, der meldet sich die ganze Zeit schon ganz geduldig. Bitte schön.
I'll just ask in English. So, in kind of the world global level of politics in the past, I'd say 5-7 years, it really seems that Europe has really started to take a real big interest in global politics as an EU, as in kind of one unit, in a sense kind of balancing with the US. Since the US is moving a little bit away from Israel and Europe doesn't have that very strong connection to Israel, that kind of strong commitment that the US government has always had, how damaging would that be in the long run? Would Israel not fix this relationship with the US or strengthen a relationship with the EU be to Israel? And I guess other than the Palestinians, what could they do to fix that relationship?
So, thank you for the question. I think it's a very delicate question, so I'm going to start off with revealing my own card. So I'm not here representing the government. I'm an academic. I represent myself. So before I answer you, I'm very happy to say that I'll just tell you where I'm coming from, and then you'll be able to decide if you want to take whatever it is I'm going to say with a grain of salt. So I'm an Israeli, I'm Jewish, I'm secular, I'm on the left side of the political map, and everything I say is framed by my own personal convictions and views, and I disagree with the government, and I disagree with the policies. So that being said, now I can explain why I think that damage in this sense really depends on the position of the viewer, because the way I would see damage is very different from the way a right-wing Israeli would see damage in terms of whether a Palestinian state ends up being established or not. So it's very relative. I think that in this geostrategic situation, if America pulled away and Europe pressed more, there is a chance that it might lead the Israeli government, to make more concessions. If you're a right-wing Israeli, you'd see it as damaging. If you're a left-wing Israeli, it would be defined as increasing the chances of establishing a Palestinian state, you won't see it as damaging. So it really depends on where you're sitting, and that's why I think it's important to frame it in advance, and you can agree with me or disagree with me, and most Israelis disagree with me. as the recent election said, and it's legitimate, it's a democracy. Personally, I would like to see more pressure, because I think the government needs to be pressured into making these concessions. That's my personal view.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich fürchte, wir müssen diesen Teil der Diskussion jetzt erstmal vertagen, ist aber überhaupt nicht schlimm, weil wir im Anschluss, ja, das erwähnte ich schon, den Empfang haben, bei dem Sie auch nochmal mit Ariane Tabatabai und Ori Rabinowitz sprechen können. Dazu möchte ich Sie jetzt schon ganz herzlich einladen. Pünktlich zum Ende unserer Diskussion kommt hier die Sonne nochmal kurz raus, ist nicht nur der Scheinwerfer, nee, ist wirklich die Sonne. Das nehme ich jetzt mal als gutes Zeichen. Ich möchte mich ganz herzlich bedanken bei unseren engagierten Diskutantinnen hier auf dem Panel. Herzlichen Dank an Ariane Tabatabai und Ori Rabinowitz. Und natürlich, wie immer, auch an Sie ein ganz herzliches Dankeschön fürs aktive Zuhören und auch für die spannenden Fragen und Kommentare. Ich habe angefangen mit einem Film, nämlich mit Ziemlich, beste, Freunde, und ich möchte aufhören mit einem Lied von Queen. Da gibt es einen bekannten Refrain sozusagen, I can't live with you, but I can't live without you. Das scheint mir auch so ein bisschen das Motto für Iran und Israel im Nahen Osten zu sein. In diesem Sinne, einen schönen Abend und ich freue mich, Sie beim Empfang noch zu sehen.